My name is Igor Sikorsky Jr., and I am the third son of Igor Sikorsky, the aviation pioneer. And I'm here to share, if I can, some of the memories and the visions of Igor Sikorsky Sr. as a person, what he thought, how he lived, and what he dreamed. So that is a side of Igor Sikorsky that needs to be explored and preserved.
I am Nickolai Sikorsky, Igor Sikorsky, the famous designer. I am his second son, and I am here hoping, to the extent that words can work, to tell about a very remarkable man that Igor and I have the privilege of being sons. And our idea was that now that I am nearly 93 and my brother is going to be 90, so it's about time for us to leave any direct first-person experiences that we had of this rather remarkable man, and also to remember, just as Igor so well indicated, that while we have a history where you can record that a given person has played a given role in the history of aviation, but there are less often emphasis placed on exactly what produced that record of achievement in worldly terms. And so I'm here happy to go on record and make as clear a picture, or a clearer picture, of the man rather than just his achievements.
I just wanted to say, normally we would just come and meet with you guys to say, what do we, what do we want to make a film about? But we decided to kind of record this meeting because I know you guys, and we're just trying to
Harvey, and it would be all right if I on occasion address Harvey by name, that Harvey, I think you made a point here that I want to develop, for instance. If I say that, that's okay.
That's perfect, because we know each other, because
Sure.
he's my godfather.
Well, and we went, and we met you at the door. That's already on tape. So yes.
I love you guys. All right, so tell me about the project. What is the project that you guys think, and how can we put this project together? What is the essence of this project, and how did this all happen?
Well, I felt that it was important to show a dimension of father beyond just the aviation pioneer. That is a very important part, and it's the part that most people know because they know of his work on helicopters, and many know of his work. He built the first four-engine plane in the world in Russia in 1913. So that has been spelled out very well. But father was a Renaissance genius. He was deeply interested in astronomy, Egyptology, world history, and also what he called the search for higher realities, which was a mystical, spiritual search. And I think my brother Nickolai remembers all of those days also, and I'm sure can add to what I said.
Yes, very well said, I think. Are we already on?
We're on.
Well, it's a big topic, of course. Incidentally, I could mention at this moment that it's a typical coincidence of the many seeming coincidences that we are sitting here together without planning ahead at all, that tomorrow is to be my father Igor Sikorsky's 130th birthday, which took place in Kiev, in the then Russian Empire of the Ukraine. And he was a true product of a different age. And for us as people who grew up with him, a tasty experience of a different world in some ways. And yet, this unique individual did great things. This was an identity which crossed the ocean effortlessly. And that in itself makes Igor Sikorsky a rather special person. I could start in any number of ways, but I think very appropriate on a broad range of issues is the fact that in 1900, when he turned 11 years of age, he had a vivid dream. And the dream was precise enough that he told his family and recorded it and remembered it throughout his life. The details was very simple. He was walking along an aisle, lavishly decorated in terms of a rug and walnut paneling on either side, doors, and a delicate bluish light. And he also felt a strange, delicate vibration as he walked. And just as he reached for the beautifully paneled door, he woke up. 30 years later, as the world's largest amphibian was slowly sinking in terms of altitude, Dad left the pilot compartment and began to walk through the interior of the aircraft because he had not been familiar with the way this ship was outfitted before its delivery to Pan American. And then he had the vivid feeling, I've been here before. And he remembered the dream. And I think the fact that this was, the dream itself took place 3 years before the first flight of the Wright brothers. So the idea of being in an airship, which is what he immediately sensed in the dream, gives us some idea of the sort of personality and the sort of mysterious aspects to things that he had to accept as part of his life. He was, by the way, not a sentimentalist per se. He was a very well put together human being. So when I tell these things, I tell them not as a person who had instability and kept on attributing facts and events to special events. Still, Dad attributed to an element he identified as intuition, the fact that on many, or at least by several very vital times in his early creative work, when nothing was known about aerodynamic functions and laws, he found himself reaching for the right alternative out of many. And several times this meant why I am here talking, because in one particular case he was ready to fly an aircraft And in the next morning, and he woke up at night and went to where it was being assembled and rethought and reconstructed a part which would have killed him if he had not had this awareness late at night that something was not right with that particular part. And of course, there are many other examples which the people who know the history of aviation point out, that my father, for example, became aware of the laws of induced drag before anyone else seems to have hit on them, and thereby he was able to create the world's first four-engined aircraft, first successful four-engined aircraft, which was the famous Ilya Muromets, by using what is known as a low aspect wing, I should have said high aspect ratio wing, which was harder to build than what was being done in those days, but was the only wing which would have been suitable to lift the world's first long-distance heavy four-engined aircraft, and to start a whole series of production that makes Russia, right now, call him the father of all long-distance aviation. Because at the time, in 1913, May 13, when the great first variant of that series with Dad at the controls took off, it changed the world, because the longest record at the time of any aircraft was, and this was less than 10 years after Wright's first flight. And still in many areas, the Wright Flyer was the standard method of flight. And to be in an aircraft which had a washroom and a little dinette and the ability to fly and the ability to be controlled. And on that subject, I just wanted to try to present it in human terms. The idea of size going beyond a certain point was very firmly fixed amongst anyone even hoping to fly after the Wright brothers. The idea being that if you look at nature, nothing approaching even the size and weight of an ostrich flies, that there's a limit. There was even something called the Reynolds Law, which I had no reason to know. And I must now say, on the strength of his reminiscences about it, that before that first flight, all sorts of negative ideas, like the ones I just expressed, came up in his mind, and he just knew that he would fly.
Wait, I want to come back to that, but I want to
Yeah.
know the difference when you guys first said to me, hey, let's make a film about my dad. What's the difference between this story and all of the other Sikorsky stories? What is the different angle on this story than from all the other things that we can read about Igor Sikorsky or we can see in the museums?
I think the big difference is that his career in aviation, which Nickolai has very well opened up, started back in 1913 when he was only 24 years old. He built the first four-engine plane in the world. But that career, which also spanned the amphibian era, which started passenger travel, and then obviously pioneering the helicopter, that is well talked about, and for good reason, because he's one of the aviation pioneers. But what I think Nickolai has also pointed out is a facet of father as a mystic. And that's not usually the way you think of aviation pioneers. And a mystic he was, because he felt first that he relied very much on intuition. He felt that he also, and you touched on it, Nickolai, felt that he could that great advances in humankind came from almost seeing the future or perceiving something in the future. That is definitely what his aviation was. But it was his life, which was also very interested in humanity, humanity's progress, and remember, he lived through the Russian Revolution, the Depression, and World War I and II. So he saw the failures of modern man and the failure of relying solely on mental power without reaching for some higher dimension, what he called search for higher realities. And I think that is a dimension of his that hasn't been well spelled out, and I think my brother Nickolai in particular is uniquely suited to talk about Father's search for a higher level of consciousness in humanity.
That's interesting, and we can kind of develop on that from two directions. One, that and I'm now sharing this because this was something that I listened to him discuss lovingly, that he had an ability as a person to communicate what was considered by experts an impossibility in situations where if he didn't have that ability, the event would not have happened. When Dad, at the age of 23, or even 22, became the head of the flying department of the Russell Baltic Railroad factory, it was because the genius director of that company, which in Russia had the equivalent importance of General Motors at its height in the 50s. It was very important. And so when Father proposed the idea of ignoring the best advice of the best minds on the subject and to go ahead and build a giant four-engined aircraft for its time, the director, who was very practical and lifted the Russell Baltic organization into its place as one of the best and most important, this man, listening to this then 23-year-old dreamer, said to him, go ahead. This ability to overcome the weight of the well-intentioned experts by seeing something a little beyond their method of perception was, I think, kind of unique with Dad. Now, Igor very kindly brought in that, and it may be the key to what we really want to communicate. Transcendent reality was an interest of my father's which was probably stimulated by his experiences with some kind of an extrasensual perception, which he experienced at various times in his life at very important moments. So with that preparation, with that understanding that it was possible to look ahead, for example, in time, and that's an unusually well articulated part of his personal being, that he was so aware that this faculty worked that he actually, in his autobiography, discusses his sincere feeling that it's a faculty that could and should be developed. That it wasn't just something that he said, oh, I'm special, or this is some sort of a special force that I happen to be lucky to experience. No, he recognized it with the modesty, which was very typical of him, to say not that this is me, or special me, or that some special power loves me. He simply said, this is a faculty, it's real, I experienced it, and I recommend that it be studied formally, that it is valuable, and I can attest to that.
This higher reality, his search for higher reality is just like his search for aviation and how to be able to get to a higher altitude.
That's right. That's exactly what I had in mind. The search for higher realities was obviously one of his aviation pursuits, very clearly. And Father had many times when he was, I remember he was introduced sometimes as the man who broke all the laws of gravity, and he laughed afterwards. He said, no, I didn't learn to break the laws of gravity, I learned to obey them. And that was the pattern of his life. But that search for higher realities meant that life was more important and more meaningful than just the material plane. And so for him, success was success as an aviation pioneer, of course, but also the search for the meaning that went beyond the mere creation of mechanical machines.
That's beautifully said, and if you like, I'll get into
Please
that
do.
a little bit more deeply. Dad was probably one of the world's outstanding mathematicians. What he could do with that slide rule of his, thousands of pounds of computers could never duplicate. I was astonished at what he could do with a slide rule, but there was more. I'd like to describe it in this way. To begin with, he was opened up to the possibility of extrasensory experience and perception by his success in the aircraft historic field. And I could just quickly outline, they were long-distance, multi-motor, heavy aviation. The second area was the development of the classic flying boat clippers over long distance, which made it possible to cross oceans and so forth. And then, of course, the last was the helicopter. But assuming then that this material success emboldened him, maybe is the term to use, to have more confidence in the sorts of things that my dear brother Igor so nicely opened up for us, the search for higher realities. And on that subject, I wanted just to talk a little bit about my personal experience of Dad in that area. Being an incredible astronomer, I should say mathematician, and an avid astronomer who knew the names of most of the stars closest. He knew their names and their distance in light years, and he could discourse on, I think, 16 or 18 of the most important stars. And I'm coming to the point I want to make. The ability to not only mentally absorb a fact, like the fact that a star or a constellation is 500 light years away, or even thousands of light years away, like traveling at 187,000 miles per second, means that when we begin to try to digest the grandeur and dimension of the kind of universe we are growing ever more conscious of being in, for us it is still, believe me, I know from my own experience, it is a given figure, some cardinal number, and a number of zeros. And when we get into beginning to conceive of what the dimensions, known dimensions of the universe are, we would have to put down a number and then a row of zeros, which would go from wall to wall of this room, or even from the borders of the estate, of numbers of zeros, and we have not actually known anything because we blank out. We don't experience versus know. This difference in terms of higher realities is emphasized consciously was by Dad, who was able to feel what was the limit of the mind and where another faculty had to take over. And the faculty, of course, is consciousness and awareness. These are two ways in which he was trying to communicate what it means to deal with the majestic immensity of the universe. And he fed off this in the last 5 years or so of his life. I still remember clearly his coming home. If it was a clear night, and in those days it was a clear night, beaming with gratitude. We were talking about coincidences like your helicopter, where he would say the fact that we have a transparent atmosphere and that we are confronted with an immensity which so far goes beyond our mental capacity to digest, was one of the reasons why he felt that his search toward a higher reality, which seemed to be manifest in grandeur and majesty and order. And he used to sort of tie that up to the fact that when he read biblical accounts, and which were really earthly products, a response to some sort of a reality put into words, is what most organized religion is. He felt that higher reality can speak to you directly through experience. And that experience is there for us to gather through awareness. And sometimes we sort of exchanged with each other what he really meant by experience. And of course, we found ourselves discussing the fact that in this case, I will use this moment, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of us sitting here are the product of an unbroken line of life. That is to say, all of our ancestors, going back to the very first single cell, had to live long enough to pass life on to the next generation. So we're sitting here as proof of the miracle when dead stone and minerals began to live. But at that time, there was a relative, life was like a virus. And little by little, it began to grow more complex. And of course, in our time, we have those forms of life all the way up to ourselves. And we can boldly claim one important point. We can know higher reality in terms of where it is going and how. All we need is 2 points in space for a direction. We can then draw a line and then continue that line in the same direction. And the point tells us that if there is one thing that happened to life after it was created, it was the expansion of awareness. And that is what is happening now. In other words, the kind of superhuman reality that Dad felt he was ingesting and experiencing showed that dead stone had arrived at that stage of progress where an expansion of reality, an expansion of awareness became possible, of realities which we can demonstrate were virtually infinite, simply in the size of this spatial and time-oriented universe. So I will just urge, as a witness to this incredible man coming home into the house, from a commune with that higher reality outside. To the best of my knowledge, that was a reasonably proper Russian Orthodox Christian. But I would not say, as some people would like to say, that he prayed, because whenever we touched on the subject, sometimes Father would say, prayer is usually asking for something, even if it's a high-level prayer. Lord, bless me, keep me well. Lord, I pray that I wake up tomorrow, and so forth. They were always requests. And so Father's rather unique experience, which I think he communicated to us as children, was just that he was already experiencing on a higher level realities we can demonstrate to ourselves how we don't do by saying, all right, just try and experience 1,000,000 light years. Well, he could and did, but he would come home, I won't say with tears exactly, but with awe of the love of the majesty and order of the universe, of which he was uniquely capable of experience.
I just want to jump in, and so he grew up as an Orthodox Christian,
Yeah.
in a world where atheist communism came in. He did not like the dogma of the religion, did not enjoy a dogma of any religion, and then he came and embraced the Christianity in the United States a little bit, but he never got into the endless pursuit, the madness of of materialism.
No, he never was
Churchy, in the
churchy.
strictest sense.
He was also never material things were. He loved them. He loved
Yeah.
machines. He took good care of them, but that was not his objective. And yet, there's a paradox there, because obviously his aviation career was devoted to machines. But his life was, he saw a higher purpose there. One of the things he said on his desk when he, on the day he died, there was a letter which they've kept there. He died before he could sign it. But where he talked about this dream that the helicopter would be a life-saving instrument. And he says in that letter, and he said many times to our hearing, that that was one of the things he was most proud of.
Yes.
That the helicopter served the purpose of saving lives. And it did, of course. And I know that for a long time he would sign a certificate which went to any crew members of a helicopter who performed a life-saving instrument.
Yes. By the thousand he did. If I may just then buttress that, and it's beautiful that you mentioned it. If somebody asked me right now, what do you remember of your father? You know, what, if possible, can you give me a word? And I would have no difficulty. I tried it this morning just in case I was going to be asked. And I would have to say a loving human being. And this again, I want to stress, I'm not speaking about a sentimental love, but he loved everyone and everything. Trust me, I am not exaggerating. Aside from just one category, which was communist radical socialism. But otherwise, there was not a single human being, I think, who ever heard Father raise his voice in anger. We certainly didn't, and we had occasion when we certainly provoked it and so forth. But he actually, things and people and history, he loved, as Igor brought the history so much, for example, that he could name all the pharaohs of ancient Egypt by name. He could mention all the leaders of Russia, the czars, by name and date and character. The Roman emperors, he knew them. That's the reason why I'm telling this. And of course, in astronomy, as I mentioned before, so this total recall with love. And it's interesting that when my dear brother, who knows quite a lot about transcendental reality formally in history of man's search of ultimate reality, Father would not have said, I'm seeking ultimate reality. He would say, I am privileged to experience it, which is a little bit different. There's this, because seeking the meaning of life, to which he answered beautifully in some of the questions and so forth, but was the idea that it was amenable to the mental faculty. I think the letter that Charles Lindbergh, who was one of Dad's most intimate friends, wrote to my mother upon Dad's passing is very revealing of several things. One, an unexpected penetration and awareness that Lindbergh obviously had of that significance. And of course, proof of the kinds of things they talked about when they weren't talking about flight. And that's another interesting area that we could even discuss here, because I was privileged to be at several meetings. But Lindbergh wrote, and this is worth recording, "When I start to write about Igor, it is hard to know where to begin, for he was such a great man, and his life covered such a broad expanse of the material, intellectual, and spiritual worlds. I know of no man who so merged these worlds together, or who could so move from one to the other to the benefit of all." Who thought that this uneducated pilot, ex-pilot, could think this way? And I think the influence went both ways. One other paragraph. "His scientific designs gained from his spiritual awareness, just as his spiritual awareness was enhanced by his scientific knowledge, and he understood, as few men do, the essential relationship involved." So Lindbergh wrote a little bit more commensurate with my mother's experience and so forth, but the point was that this is the kind of effect that these two men had on each other, because Father profoundly respected Lindbergh, the lone eagle, for Lindbergh alone accomplished. And so Father was tempted even to say at one time that it was actually the work of individuals that moved mankind ahead. For instance, these were his words and they were quoted. In other words, he was suggesting not disrespect, but that committees weren't always the only way to achieve anything in the world. And incidentally, I want to finish this interlude, if I may. I don't mean the whole process, by just adding that Father represented the ideal man as he was represented by several ancient religions and many of the major ones. I just recently became acquainted with the Bhagavad Gita, which is the holy book of the Brahmins, the Hindus of India. And I was astonished when I realized the emphasis on be kind, be loving, and don't be judgmental. And this in India was an idea that went back at least 2,000 years, some of it as much as 3 and 4. The Bhagavad Gita is a very ancient religion, probably the first great religion of them all. So I cannot say enough that when I was going to say that Dad emphasized the individual, it would not be to any kind of a criticism toward committees, but it was an indication of where he stood in preference. And it was the same way about everyone and everything. And for that reason, almost nothing that came within his purvey, when he referred to that, wouldn't have some kind of a diminutive. In other words, it wouldn't be William, it would be Bill. It would be Harv or Dear Harv. And in Russian, there's a much more active kind of a diminutive, so that in case Dad referred to his Ford tractor as Fordushka, never just a Ford, or his Lincoln as Lincolnushka, not Lincoln. My dear Otto, my beloved wife, would you please A, B, and C? It was genuine. It was not a formalism, but I cannot remember Dad simply using a raw object for his comment. It would always be in some loving way, because he was the most loving man I knew ever in my life, without being a sentimentalist. This was an inner respect and an inner awe of the mere existence of anyone or anything in this world, which he respected and loved so much.
I think his philosophy, I think his life was, and he used this term a lot, I think he sought to reconcile reason with spirituality, reason with belief. I think that was a central keystone. I also would want to say, by the way, just on the, perhaps going from the sublime to the ridiculous, but I do want to mention that he also had a sense of humor.
Yes.
He had a sense of humor about himself. I remember his saying that when he started building and designing aircraft, I remember his saying that in the days when he started, the designer was also the chief test pilot. And this had the effect of eliminating bad designers. That was one of his favorite thoughts. And so he would say, when someone talked about him as a pioneer, he would say, I survived. I was lucky enough to survive. And so he would downplay his genius, though it was there and it saved his life, though he had a number of accidents. And he also would, I remember, said in the 1920s when he first came to America, he said, aviation was a very, very dangerous business in the 1920s. But when you tried to start a company, the biggest danger was death by starvation. And that's what it was like, because they began pioneering work when it was all pennies, dollars was what they had to have. I think there was also another aspect of his life that we haven't touched on. One of his other very close friends was Sergei Rachmaninoff, the Russian famous musician who was over here, composer and musician. And Rachmaninoff was the first vice president of Sikorsky Aircraft and was very important in funding them in those early years. And that was a dimension also of his love of music. You haven't really been able
Yes.
to touch on that, but he saw music as almost a spiritual expression of some kind of higher reality, and he was devoted to the classics, more of the classics than modern music, but there he was. So I thought, I just want to mention that also, because that's a facet
Yes.
of Father. Music
Yes.
and humor both were different
Yes.
aspects of a multifaceted man.
Tell me about the squirt gun fight. I just want to hear about the water fight you guys had.
Oh, well, I can tell you about that. Years ago, more than half a century ago, Father had the Lindberghs over, and Lindbergh had 5 children, and I must have been 10 or 8 or 10 or teens, and we got into a water fight. Well, we had the strange memory of seeing our parents acting silly, because my father and Lindbergh got into the water fight. And Father got the hose going, and I always remember, one of the vivid pictures I remember was Charles Lindbergh went into the kitchen and filled up a bucket of water, and he was going to blast Father with this bucket of water, and Mother running out saying, "Not in the house, Charles." So that was one of the memories. So there were these very human kind of memories, as well as the political and spiritual and aviation search that they all shared, and that these parts of these personalities, and certainly very much shown in Father, was an interplay of being able to deal with material reality, life as it is, whether it's cutting the grass or telling stories of very human nature, and also the search for excellence in aviation and the dreams of a higher, more nobler world. One of his unpublished manuscripts was A Nobler World or None.
I love the fact that you brought in the music, which was all my recollection as a pre-teenager and even teenager was the K part playing. This is not for the record. I mean, we would redo it, playing great music. And Father knew it very well, you know, Bach and Brahms and Tchaikovsky and Prokofiev, even more Shostakovich. So the thing is that was fed to him. If we're looking for a formula for what a creative man does while he creates, he fed off that Capehard with the great music. Always, and I remember this indelibly because he was kind of tough on our sleeping sometimes because he played it quite loud. But the important point was that at night he would turn off the lights and walk and think. And whether it was the helicopters or the ultimate meaning of life, it would be music supported. As you as an artist in this field know, many movies without the soundtrack would be pretty dead. That communicates a lot. Well, Dad talked on that level very, very effectively. The other thing, in the interest of truth, and I'll just be quick about this, I don't know whether I feel a little bit uneasy about not clarifying for the record the relationship between mind and higher reality. I think the best way for me to express the way I understood my conversations with Dad was, and it was very much reinforced, by the way, by certain examples, that there are levels of the mind whose world one must respect. But there are other levels which we know of, which the mind can simply fails to deal with. And that's why I tried to communicate a little bit with the idea of experiencing the truth about the universe, which means to get into an area where the mind falters, you see. But it's not so much a direct conflict between one and the other, because Dad understood the purvey of each of these faculties, and there was a faculty for the mind and a faculty which transcended the mind. And by the way, that's, I think Lindbergh picks up on that, because let me see, intellectual, material, and spiritual, he said. Now I think you could add to this a little bit experiential in terms of emotions, but I don't think Father was even conscious of analyzing the fact that he himself, as Mother said, loves everybody. So when Father would say, "Dear Lily, I love you so much," you'd say, "You love everybody." You see? I remember that kind of a feeling coming up and it was true.
But he had enough love to give. So he's a multifaceted Renaissance style genius, right?
Yes.
So, but who in history would you compare your father to, or who currently would you compare your father to?
Well, I think, let me answer that a little bit obliquely, because I remember as kids, we must have been young adults, we had went through an exercise where we tried to think of the giants in human history and Leonardo da Vinci, and so that I'm answering the question not with contemporary people, because that's harder to judge, but we can judge in history, and Father did. Leonardo da Vinci and Sir Isaac Newton and Ben Franklin, and all of these, those three, and there were others, Schweitzer and others, but all of them had multi-dimensional people. That is, Ben Franklin is an example, who was both a politician in the Revolutionary War, a diplomat, but also wrote books and experimented about it, electricity through the kites into the, so it was the multi-dimensional aspect of the person that I think I would mention, and that he respected, and that what we see in our trying to describe this man to the future, that they would remember him as a multifaceted person.
Igor, I love what you just said, the harder thing to get across is I was frequently aware of, for example, you mentioned Newton. Isaac Newton was an awful man. And in many ways, he dealt with his students mercilessly and so forth. Another example would be
Beethoven.
I was going to say right away that Nickolai, he was an awful man. I mean, he was miserable to live with and miserable with his own life, and he mangled his finances and so forth. So, in other words, the qualities that are in a creative person apparently are not totally dependent on the quality of man, but it makes, I think, more important in some ways the existence of a combination of an extraordinarily good man with a very productive person. Because Father produced the impression of Mother accused him of weakness. She said, you're feminine almost, with your disinterest in fighting for things, and so forth. And Father would always say, thy will be done, not my will. He was in love with the world as it was on a very broad range. So he, I think, uplived to the idea, judge not, which is one of the biblical requirements for a good person. And I don't feel that Father was ever conscious of that, but it was totally his character. He found the good in everyone and everything.
But there's also an aspect or a story that isn't always well known. Father came here, and the company that he founded became part of what was then United Aircraft, a large conglomerate. Well, in 1931 or 2, the conglomerate, the leaders who were then in East Hartford came to Father, and they said, we have a depression on, and things are very bad, and you have to fire your two most important assistants, or two brothers, Glurak brothers. And Father said, first, he said, I've lived through a revolution, I've lived through 2 world wars, a world war, and a depression, so, this depression is minor compared to what I've lived through. But he also then said, you can cut my salary in half and give it to these 2 men so we can keep them working. Now, I don't think you find many industrialists now who would say, cut my salary in half so I don't have to let people go. But he did. And that went on for about 6-7 years. I had the records on it. For 7 years, he gave up half his salary to keep these 2 men employed. And so that was a side of a person who cared about those who worked with him. And they were always, the people who worked with him were aware that they were a team and that he wasn't overriding boss, quite the
Yeah.
contrary. Always addressed people by their first names. It was a small group who pioneered first first the work starting of the company in 20s, and then in the 30s when they were building amphibians, and then of course the pioneer work in the helicopter. So that was an aspect of his relationship with people where he was ready to put his pocketbook on the line, not just words.
Yeah.
Well, you know, there's so much to talk about on this, and so we know we're going to be doing a lot of interviews, but who should we be talking to, and when we make this film, who should we be talking to? We talked about the Lindberghs, but who should we be talking to, and where should we go? What are the locations you boys see us going to, and who are the people we should be contacting?
Certainly, if Reeve Lindbergh was willing to talk, you would have a dimension there that would be very helpful, I think, because the two men spent a lot of time together, and so we have the memories of Lindbergh, and the Lindbergh children have the memories and of the history.
But it's interesting that Harvey's question should be answered by saying, simply interview us 20 years ago, because the death rate has been terrific, you know.
You have to understand the people who knew Father. I mean, I'm almost 90 and Nickolai's 93, so
they're pretty well gone.
I'll have to answer that. I don't know.
What about Danny Libertino, the archives?
Danny Libertino, who
And he
is
knew
the
that.
head of the archives. I think
Sikorsky
would be
Archives.
a very good person. Also, a man named Professor Von, V-O-N, Hardesty, Hardesty.
Yeah.
He lives in Virginia now, is retired as a historian for the Smithsonian, aviation historian. He's written a number of books about aviation history, but good 3 or 4 about Father's role in it. So I would say, and we could persuade him to come up here, I think, and if he did, because he has visited going to the archives,
Good.
places like that. There's also a Russian, perhaps Sasha would be willing to talk about when he came here. What do you think?
Possibly that would be
He's a
Igor.
professor.
I will, yeah.
Russian, but quite fluent in English, taught here in English for 20 years, but he's back in Russia now.
Yeah,
And
that's
he's able to share the impact Father's name has in Russia, as almost a almost a mythical figure. He's the kid who left Russia and made good, and he's a symbol of Russian intelligence and spirituality. So that's both, well, because Father was very active in Russia before the revolution as an aviation pioneer.
And that's a very good idea that Igor's mentioning. I just wanted to stress that when the Soviets took power, it got to the point, as you yourself had the experience with somebody describing, that where some writer wrote one paragraph on that and it cost him 5 years in the Gulag. That was a total non-person. And what...
In the communist era.
During that, and the thing about Portnyagin that Igor mentioned, Dr. Portnyagin, Alexander Sasha, by the way, was that he brought back, he was one of the people, and it wasn't so long ago, who after the end of the regime, essentially, well, the last year of the old regime, they began
Yes,
to, and
I
I,
was over there to celebrate Father's centennial of his birth.
that's the interesting thing.
Yeah.
But the one thing I want to just, that's it, to point out is that now, the people who remember so ardently the existence of Father also can understand that the old regime was trying to say nothing done by Russians was any good. It was the communist regime which saved Russia from being a nothing and created a modern civilization. So people like Father, if they honor him as the person who moved Russia forward almost a full year with the Ilya Muromets, that Russia was then an absolute leader, and it was not a communist regime that did it. And the emphasis in communism was to say, we have brought a primitive nation into world level importance. And that's what makes the whole experience now. There are still people who go to Portnyagin, who has a whole museum dedicated to Dad and so forth. Well, and other people like Dad, and they say, what are you popularizing this traitor for? You know, why traitor? Because he left his country. He's not a real Russian. Why are you? And Portnyagin says, on the contrary, he's a real Russian, and that he doesn't go quite that far to say, but whereas communism is a European idea, it's not a Russian idea.
Well, tell me about how the family left Russia. What happened?
Well, Father was married at that time. His wife with a daughter lived in the Kiev in the Ukraine. But Father's work on aviation was in the St. Petersburg area. That's about 800 miles apart. When the revolution came on, Father was told by some of the workers that he was on the list to be shot the next day, because the communists viewed anyone who was an engineer or an officer as part of the upper class. And at the time of the revolution, they would be shooting anyone who was an officer or an engineer. Father was forced to leave Russia. So he left Russia, went to France, which was still in World War I, and started to design planes for the French. And then, of course, with the armistice, the aviation industry ended worldwide, and he came to America. But he was permanently separated from his first wife, and they were divorced. My mother was a very young teenager in Japan when the revolution broke out in Russia, and there was no way to go home. And ultimately, she was left Japan as a teenage refugee and came to America. And so they met here. But they left Russia in separate paths as a result of the revolution. You add anything to that?
No, that's exactly right. What I have to add is a little bit scandalous, but in fact, we won't get into the scandalous part. What actually, Dad adored his first wife, and when she was expecting the child, her mother refused to let her go to St. Petersburg, and so she apparently fell in love with her gynecologist. And so the issue was resolved way back then. She went away with this fellow, and he was an ardent revolutionary, by the way. And so that is to say, the first wife was very, very young and impressionable, I guess, and so forth. But that is why that relationship ended, was formally dissolved. But if Harvey's question concerned Tanya, did it, or?
Yeah, well, Tanya was the daughter of his first wife, and did come here to America in the 1920s, and had 4 children, Boris, a youngster, and Lisa, who lives here in Connecticut, and 2 sons. So that line became part of America.
Yes. She was a very talented lady.
Well, it's been written about him that during the short span of life, we must find our own insights into our relationship with the existence in which we participate so briefly. Right? It says, so Nick, I know you have, during his short lifespan, we must find our own insights into the relationship with existence into which we participate so briefly.
No, I think he left us with the deep conviction that is the purpose of life, is to find the purpose of some relationship to a higher reality. I think that was, at least for me, the most significant message he had, that the search is what it's all about. And devoting your life, yes, there's a whole material aspect, but beyond the material aspect of life is a search for trying to understand your relationship with other life, with community, that's important, and beyond that, with some sort of higher destiny. I think there is a search for higher growth, higher understanding of your relationship with a spiritual destiny that is part of our consciousness, part of what you call the growth of consciousness. And we've reached a stage of evolution, and we and Father taught us, I think, by example. He never taught us what to believe. He never said, it was by example.
Yeah.
But his example was search for meaning, the meaning of life. And I think that was his search, and I think that would be what he would have wanted us to carry on.
Igor, that's a wonderful description. As the question is excellent, in a very specific way, it had to be the following thing. Living with Father gave me early on in life, I said to myself, how is it possible for a person who is so sensitive and loving and soft-seeming to accomplish so much? Because I knew of the things that were going on in the factory and so forth, and I would see how people responded, and everybody had stories about Father who as chief engineering, would walk quietly behind a step to some engineer that he knew what he was doing, and Father knew that he was on the wrong track. And these were the kinds of stories I heard by the dozens. And so they say, don't let me disturb you, what Father would say, something like that, and then say, I love what you're doing, and it's very, very well done, and so forth. But you could, my recommendation, you might even try this other area of exploration. It would always be that way. So the overall feeling that and you probably would be able to endorse this, was, here I am living with this person who is so boundlessly good. How is it possible that he achieves so much and gets people to do so much for him without yelling at them or ever demonstrating a power over them? It was always the opposite almost. It was, excuse me, but I think maybe, you know, it was a little bow and a little smile and so forth to the guy who sweeps the floors in the plant and so forth. So the issue simply stated was, again, I repeat, I was conscious, actually, growing up and wondering how is it possible that this goes against the expected behavior of a person having great power over other people. And instead they have this person boundlessly good, boundlessly concerned with their welfare, knew their family sometimes well enough that Dad would ask the guy who sweeps the floor, how is your wife? I understand she's unwell, or something like that, you know. A total commitment to being a good human being, and it always seemed that the work part of it was subservient to the human relationship. Really. That really is the way it was with Father. It didn't matter who or what he was dealing with. And he dealt the same way with presidents as with the people who, you know, carry materials around and so forth.
All right. So we were talking earlier today.
Yeah. The hearing thing, it's what the sad part is, of course, that Father, we inherited, and it's gone down to the next generation too, the deafness. Mother lost her hearing. In later life, Dad lost his hearing. He was very handicapped in hearing. And so the two parents, but in my specific case, in training, as I remember it, although I think it was happened in Germany, some guy assembled a bazooka with a high explosive shell in it, and he did not latch the bazooka right so that it tilted down. And so a high explosive bazooka shell, it couldn't have been much more than 40 feet away, blew up, and I was deaf for 3 days, and then this hearing began to come back. But then altogether it became gradually weaker, so that it's pretty complete now. But it was the case with Dad too. So as I say, Dad always worried about that in a way when he would have his many meetings with, and maybe the person, the lady particularly, who would be, it's particularly with ladies, that because they have the higher and so forth, and so maybe the lady was saying, for all he knew, my dog just died, and then Father would smile and say, that's wonderful, you know, or something like that, because he was boundlessly courteous, and that for that reason he was very much aware of developing a modus operandi where he could more or less fit a very neutral reaction to most anything that people said to him. But that was in the social sense, in other words, which were often enough the case. I mean, he knew presidents, and he knew, you know, the whole General Motors, that is, he used to call Kettering Stew, I think, and so forth. He used to know people like that, and in which case he could kind of, but he didn't like to admit that he was getting deaf, but he was getting pretty darn deaf, and that's where Igor Igor is okay. Serge is beginning to feel the loss, but even Igor's son is complaining that he is losing his hearing.
Okay, I just wanted to talk about your level, and you're talking about where you lost down from. You used to play.
Oh yes, that's the thing, that when one begins, it's a gradual process. And as a musician, I began sometimes to suspect that, and even was in one case where I was soloing, or two cases where someone said, you know, up in the upper partials, you're a little flat. because the upper partials, when they're going, and they will go with age in our particular genetic component, go first. But everyone, I think virtually every, and it's with males more than with females, we lose the upper partials first. And the effect of this, for example, for a violinist was devastating, because on the piano you could continue, and the piano was well tuned, you would be able to play. But the violinist is making the pitch with their hand and minuscule adjustments. And in my case, I began to tend to play a little bit flat because my upper partials were going, and I was following my lower partials, which are literally a little bit lower as well as, so that gradually developed, and it's been developing for years. And in my case, I probably tend to talk more than I should, because I find it difficult to enter in a two-way conversation comfortably, especially at a distance. That is to say, if there's a group of people seated, I will not hear everybody. And I forgot what, there was one instance at your talk session, I think it was, that somebody asked me a question, and I began to answer in a totally different way. But that's it, Harvey, in a literal sense. It's a gradual loss of upper partials. And I think, every once in a while, I think that it is, the decay is slowing down a little bit. Probably it is because there isn't much left.
It's great. Can you do us a favor? Can you speak in Russian? Because I know you want to speak in Russian. Can you tell me, look at me and tell me what this film is about in Russian?
Ну, господа, мы тут сидим, потому что мы были очень близко к самым главным части того, что мы выбрали, и что мы все хотим как бы знать больше об этом предмете. И предмет это как раз мой отец и наше познание и знакомство с великаном вообще. И он был великан не только по познанию и по возможности продвинуть историю авиации, но как человека главным образом, потому что о нем уже довольно много написано, по крайней мере, 3, 5, 6 книг и так далее. И это все доступно, но это все главным образом сосредоточиться на детали его произведения. Тот факт, что он был один из самых великих пионеров авиации в мире. Некоторые говорят, один из двух, некоторые первый номер, потому что он продвинул авиацию в 3 областей. Именно так называемая дальняя авиация с первым 4-моторным самолете, который был успешный и который пошел в эту продукцию. Но потом так называемые clipper ships, и потом, конечно, произведение самого лучшего способа для разрешения проблем геликоптеров. Но после этого я бы хотел сказать, что для нас был большой интерес описать человека Игоря Ивановича Сикорского как что было вообще этот человек как человек, который мог успеть столько в истории человечества.
Igor, did he tell us the story in Russian?
No, he talked about Father,
No.
talked about the fact that Father was an aviation pioneer and is usually known as an aviation pioneer, but that we wanted to share some insights into Father as a person, as a very substantial thinker about higher realities and about spiritual matters, as well as all of the practical business that went into being an engineer. And on top of it, we've also wanted to share his human side, how he related with people, how he related with people he worked with. So that's what we've said.
That's great. So I have a, we've talked about some of the people we want to meet, the professor and the guy at the archival list and the Lindberghs. Places that we would go on this film. Where do you think, would we go to the Air Museum? Would we go to Smithsonian?
Well, I think you should go to the New England Air Museum because it has a whole development there, which I think will be very good. It has pictures of all of the three careers of
Yes,
Father.
that's
They also have a very large amphibian, which is the last of the amphibians, as well as obviously the helicopter work. So I would say that's worth a visit.
Is there a paneled door and a carpet in that amphibian?
No, this is a later one. Well, I don't know, the S-44 would not look like the,
not
the S, it was the S-40 that he remembered in the,
yeah, not quite as luxurious, but because in the case of the S-40, slower flying and obviously created for a higher level clientele. At the time, it wasn't quantity, it was quality pretty much. So it was very luxurious. Well, you know, there's, yeah, the S-40, that was the result of the dream, is what you're speaking about. I don't think the S-44 was even finished in teakwood. No.
S-44 would have been 38, 39, and 41.
Yeah, and even none of those, even the S-38s, which were quite common, were already not as out and out spectacularly luxurious as the S-40 was. So if you're looking for seeing what that was like,
However, they would let you in to
Just-
the S-44, which is the last of the flying boats.
yeah,
And you'll see how they sat around tables. You compare it to how we sort of get squeezed in like sardines when we fly now. But here would be a table, like a card table, and they seat 4 people around it. You could play backgammon or chess or anything you wanted while they're flying. Because that was an era when flying was a very expensive luxury. And you were catering to people who could fly, and they weren't crammed in the way we are now when they're trying to get as many people into everything. However, you asked me where to go, and I would say definitely try the New England Air Museum,
yeah.
and
It's a
that would
great
be a
collection.
starter, and I'll think about other people that there, because the people who would know Father are probably all gone now, because, you know, we're, as I said, 2 of us are in our 90s, and you'd have to be in your 90s to remember Father, because he died. Father died in October 1972. So it's a long time ago. And
How old was he when he died, when he passed?
83,
83.
83 and a half. But that was,
All right.
he had his time of his death, and for the last years, he was deaf, virtually, and almost blind. But his mind remained sharp to the day of his death. And he, as Sergei would say, he died the way he lived, that is, causing the least amount of fuss.
He died of stroke. He was compass mentis in every way, and even physically, until the day he died at night. No, as Igor says beautifully, that's part of a prayer in Russian that, Lord, I pray that you help me to live and to be healthy and so forth, and then in a quiet, painless death would be my request, would be so forth. So in that request was fulfilled magnificently. It was an excellent death, and one of those, just in 2 words, that's worth it. When Mother called me, you were off in Maine hunting.
And I was in Canada.
Serge was in Iran speaking to the Shah of Iran, Mohammed. And I was home. So Mother said, Nicky, something has happened to Father. She didn't tell me what. She couldn't bring herself to say or deal with it. I think there was one, the neighbor was there, and so she just said, come. And halfway on there was a day very much like this, with this translucent sky, and halfway there, for what it says about the way one feels about Dad, I said he would have picked this day, for his last journey. That's the kind of a relationship that one doesn't think of that as a factor. One says that's what happened, and it happened because that's what he would have chosen. But that's,
Next time we see you, we're going to want you to do that prayer, that Russian prayer. You're going to do it in Russian, the one you
do that prayer in Russian?
Do you know it now?
Oh, yes, it was без Божия я молю у тебя здоровья и счастья и безболезненный уход, painless death. And that's what it was.
Can you tell me about the Lord's Prayer? Why he wrote about the Lord's Prayer?
Well, he wrote about the Lord's Prayer. He wrote about the future of humanity and nobler world or none. And he had a very meaningful series of lectures and essays on life, on the meaning of life, in which he had obviously a spiritual dimension in the meaning of life, a growth dimension. I think he saw life as a training school. So he clearly saw that birth was not the beginning and death was not the end, and that earth, your life here, was a time to learn about truth, if you remember the meaning of life.
Yes.
Learn about truth and purpose and help to other people. I think that the help to other people was he lived it. He didn't talk it. He lived it in his life, and as I said earlier, in the way he viewed the most important function of the helicopter, saving lives. So I think, and he was a very courteous man. He never looked down on anybody, with the exception of Joe Stalin, I'm sure, who he had correctly little respect for.
Incidentally, in line with what Igor so correctly mentioned in his, I think it is Message of the Lord's Prayer, or no, this would, at any rate, to show how he combined his mathematics with his philosophies. It was, for example, the fact that you turn to that statement and it says, for example, that the single cell in a human being expands 1,000 million times to complete a full-size.
From the embryo, that is.
From the embryo. And that's that, to pick up a number like that and then suggest that it could suggest the kind that the human being could be that that the same ratio of expansion 1,000 million times to the next step in the progress of life. And of course, Dad loved such examples. Someplace in the New Testament, which you mentioned as the kind of thing he loved, was the fact that one of the old prophets, Old Testament prophets, supposedly saw an angel, was visited by an angel, and he said, the way it is written in the Bible, it says that it would take a camel 3 months to cross its forehead. And Father nibbled that immediately. I said, you see, it was a mental expansion. He explained, the Bible explains in a physical way a spiritual truth, the next step in life. And oh, by the way, that maybe would be worth emphasizing, if we try to understand that, that we are not a static reality, we are a work in progress. and so we should be oriented not toward preserving everything the way it is, but anticipating a higher development.
And you remember how you used to say chelovek?
Oh, that's Russian. Speaking about Russians, I love what Igor just asked me. The word for man, as in mankind, is chelovek. You can ask your dear Alexandra, how do you say man, person? Chelovek. But the word is compound. It is age of the forehead. The word chelovek is composed of, so when the word came into existence, somebody had already the awareness of the importance of the mind in the development, in identifying a human being. He is the age of the forehead.